really, really, really happy, because for me, that was the moment I said, okay, I made it. You know, I got my foot in the door of a massive institution.
Welcome back to Fashion Career Stories. My name is Lucas Silva Edwards. I am a career strategist and executive coach with more than 10 years of experience in the fashion and luxury industry here in Paris, France. My role is to help you design a successful life and career in one of the most glamorous industries on the planet, but also one of the most competitive. For that reason, I have interviewed fashion professionals at different stages of their career in order to decode their best practices, tactics, and strategies. My hope for you is that you will find in this conversation some inspiration and insights that will help you build your professional journey in the world of fashion and luxury. In this episode, I will receive Isabella CARAZZA. Isabella and I met a few years ago while working together at le Bon Marché Rive Gauche, one of the most iconic department stores in the world. At that time, I was the Menswear Fashion Editor and she was a junior buyer. From day one, what stood out from her was her sheer curiosity and passion to learn everything about the fashion industry. This is why I was not surprised when she told me she was doing a PhD while working at le Bon Marché. However, the reason I wanted to have Isabella in this first season is because in my eyes, her journey is the perfect illustration that there is no one unique path to arrive to your professional objective. Isabella comes from Brazil, didn't have any previous contact, nor study in a business school, and still she managed to land one of the most coveted jobs in the industry, woman buyer in a Parisian department store. All along this episode, you will discover how to think like a buyer, what are the key elements you need to focus on. You will also learn how to use your passion and curiosity to fuel your career strategy while leveraging your skills at every step of your journey. Please enjoy this wide-ranging conversation with Isabella CARAZZA. Quick disclaimer. I have some technical problems during the recording, so you might hear some echoing at the moment when I speak. So please don't let that disturb you from this amazing conversation with Isabella. I guess I'm still learning and it's still part of the process of becoming a podcaster. So my apologies again and enjoy this conversation with Isabella CARAZZA. Hi Isabella, how are you?
Hi Lucas, I'm really happy to be here. I hope you're well too.
Yeah, I'm good. I'm so happy to have you in this podcast. I really wanted to have you here because we have known each other for quite a while, but I've always been really impressed by your journey and by your optimism. It's something that always strikes me in your profile, because you come from Brazil, you work in France, you have worked in retail and as a junior buyer. Now you're a buyer at Galeries Lafayette, and we're going to come back to that. But you also study on the side. I think you're doing your PhD at the IFM. So I was like, wow, full profile. So I really wanted to have you in this podcast and talk about all of that. Before we start and talk about your professional journey, I wanted to know where this passion for fashion or luxury come from.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me here. I'm really happy to be here with you. It's true that we've known each other for a while, and it's always been a pleasure to exchange with you. So I think I've always loved fashion. My mom tells me that before I was born, I already had 20 pairs of shoes. So I think it comes from there. But as a child, I was always drawing clothes. I was always drawn towards clothes. I always liked buying clothes, dressing up. And then growing up, I'm 31, so I'm a child. When I was growing up, there was Galliano, Dior, there was McQueen. So fashion back then was very theatrical, I would say. So it was really, really impressive to just like open a magazine and see all those clothes. And I was really drawn to that. I was really drawn to this kind of clothing. And it just, as I grew up, it just kept, I started, then internet came along, so I started Googling some things. I come from a family that travels a lot, so every time I traveled abroad, I would buy a few fashion magazines to see what was happening. And as a teenager, I was really, really in love with this world because for me it was very creative and ever-changing. And I think it's important, and this ever-changing thing was very important because from one season it was, I don't know, flowers, the other season we're talking about the sea, the other season talking, I don't know, about the universe. So as I'm someone who's a bit hyperactive, it was just very, very inspiring, and that's how I ended up in France.
Yeah, that's great. So it's really like your travels and the magazine and the fact that that ever-changing industry that kind of caught your attention. And
Yeah, and also, I mean, I'm gonna say that, and fashion, so for someone who's my age, fashion was very pop culture growing up in a way that I don't think it is today. It's a bit different, it's changed a bit, but we had series like Sex and the City where it was very fashion centric. There was also this English series from the early 90s that I watched when I was like 12, 13, which was Ab Fab. That absolutely fabulous.
okay.
That poked fun at the fashion world. There was also Project Runway that was really, really big. So fashion was very centric in like it was a very central part of entertainment. And so like when I was in New York, I was like, I want to see the places where Carrie went to. So it was really part of pop culture, and as I'm someone who's very curious, for me, it was really easy to be drawn to that as well.
Yeah, I totally relate with Sex and the City.
Mm-hmm.
I think I was probably like 19 or something like that. I was already in college, and one of our teacher told us, yeah, you need to watch shows in English to learn about to learn English. And she gave DVDs to people who wanted to have, and one of them was Sex and the City. So I discovered Sex and the City, and because it was not on TV when I was younger. And it's true for me, it was like, wow, all those dresses, the shoes. I remember like the shoes specifically for Carrie was something quite unique, the Manolo Blahnik and the heels. And I think that's why, like at least in my journey, sprung my interest for high heels. And when I did my thesis at the IFM, it was about the attractivity of high heels.
Oh, it's really cool.
And I think that's where it come from. And when I was at Lanvin as a product manager, I had the opportunity to work on women's shoes. And there is a bunch of high heels and I remember all my friends at that time. And they were like, okay, can I have one of the shoes at the private sales? So I remember all of that come from the Sex and the City. So I totally relate with what you said, the pop culture and inspired like a vision of what is fashion.
Yeah.
And after that, so when did you decide that fashion was something like you wanted to pursue? So you had that interest, but how did you choose your studies? Were they related to that right away, or did you study something more general or different?
Well, I've come a really long way. So, as you said, I'm actually from Brazil. And it's interesting because when I realized around the time I was 16, 17 that I really liked fashion, I was in some sort of crossroads because it's not an industry in Brazil. So it was either you go to a fashion school to become a fashion designer or you work with something else entirely. There's nothing like the IFM. There's not this approach of fashion as a business. And I knew that I didn't want to become a fashion designer. I didn't think I had talent for that. I drew a bit, but I knew that it wasn't really my thing. And I was thinking, when I run out of creativity, what am I going to do with my career? because for me, it's very creative. You have to be creating things all the time, and it just wasn't me. So I studied political science in Brazil, and it was very funny because when I was around 20, I was thinking maybe I could do also study fashion on the side, because at my city they had this small fashion school. So well, I could maybe do both, and then later on in my life, when I'm in my 40s, open my own brand, create my own brand. And I was like, but do I want to create my own brand? It was very, at the time, it was very, for me, working in fashion meant designing or creating things. And I wasn't really comfortable with that. And I thought that to work in fashion, you could only do that. So I finished my studies in political science. I did my exchange, my Erasmus in Italy, in Tuscany. And there's so it was really great because I love traveling, and it allowed me to travel all around Europe. And I saw so many museums, so many fashion museums. I was living next to Florence, where we have the Gucci Museum. Back then it was, because it's become a thing called Gucci Garden today, but back then Gucci was this very heritage brand still. So there was the whole history of Gucci. There was the Ferragamo Museum, so I could see the shoes, all the shoes he created. Also, the Tuscany is a tanning region in Italy, so we have all those tanneries we could see. So it was I could see a bit of a fashion city in Italy, but still, once again, a very fashion creation part of Italy. Then I started meeting people who worked in the creative industries, and I was like, what is the creative industry? Because it's something that just didn't exist in Brazil. I didn't know you could work with fashion. I didn't really know you could work with museums. I didn't really know that things that I was really passionate about, I could make a living out of them. So for me, it was a big, eye-opening moment, meeting these people who worked in fashion, in film, in museums. And I said, okay, well, if I go to Europe, I can actually work with that. So I went back to Brazil. I finished my studies in political science, and I took a plane off to France. And I landed here 8 years ago. And I was still very, very lost. So I did my master's in cultural history. So still a lot to do with fashion, but not with fashion business. And I did my master thesis about the influence of the 18th century in contemporary fashion, with a case study of Vivienne Westwood, who back then was my favorite designer. I've always really liked English fashion. And also Christian Lacroix, because I was in France and I had to learn about French fashion and study French fashion. And it's true that I'm very Anglo in my teenage culture. I was very Anglo up to maybe 5 years ago. And so I didn't really know much about French fashion. I mean, I knew about Dior, of course. I knew about Chanel. I knew about Jean-Paul Gaultier, but that was it. I didn't really follow Paris Fashion Week because my heart always beat faster with the UK. So I learned all about that. And when I was studying, I learned a lot by myself. So I would get books and books and books about fashion history, the fashion system, about sociology of fashion. And one of those books about the fashion system, I think was by a sociologist. And he talked about all the kinds of jobs you could have in fashion and how the fashion system is. And I read about buying. And I was like, this looks interesting, because I can be in touch with all the collections, which is the creative part, but I don't have to design. And once again, the person who grew up watching Sex and the City and Absolutely Fabulous, back then, buyers were invited to fashion shows. And I really wanted to go to a fashion show. And I was like, this is a dream job, because I can be in touch with the collections, I can see what's happening every season, and go to fashion shows.
And go to fashion show.
And go to fashion
Before we continue on that, there's a few things I would like to kind of double click a little bit. So you study in Brazil, then you did your exchange in Italy, so that's where you understand a little bit more, like, let's say, not the European side of fashion and the creative industries, as you said. Why did you decide to study in France at that moment, and how did you decide that master was the one appropriate for you? What was the thought process around that?
So I was actually between France and the UK. Okay. Because, well, first thing that came to my mind was that Paris is the capital fashion capital of the world. So in terms of afterwards for finding a job, it's going to be easier.
Okay.
And I had also lived a bit in Italy. I love Italy, but I couldn't. It's not a country I could live in. I think that is trauma from my family having left there. So because I come from an Italian family, and I was like, it's too close to family. I need something different.
Okay.
And I really thrive like in this cosmopolitan environments. So that's why I really like London. That's why I really like New York. Mm-hmm. And I was like, well, Paris is quite good because it's cosmopolitan. It's smaller than London, and it's the fashion capital of the world. All the big houses are here, so probably job-wise would be easier. And when I picked also the cultural studies, it was I had this thing. Okay, I've got plan A, but I need a plan B, and I need a plan C, because I'm making a big move. I'm giving up. I mean, it was. I have to say this. I'm very privileged because I had the luxury of choosing to leave home because I had a dream, and I know that many people who leave home, they don't have this choice. So I was like, I'm giving up on a lot. I'm giving up on my family, my friends, my comfort zone. I need to have so my dream is working in fashion, but if that doesn't work, if I do not manage to get in, what could I do that would make it worth to leave? Okay. And as I said, I love museums. And I said, well, if fashion doesn't work out, I can work as a museum curator, maybe at the Galeries, which is the fashion history museum.
The fashion history. Okay.
Or the Art Décoratif, which is basically this applied arts museum. So when I picked this master's, and also I think it's very important to say that France is a very business school country, and it's something that unless you grew up with French culture, you don't really realize. I didn't know that. I was very Anglo, and in the US, in the UK, you have business schools, but if you go to business school, it's because you're going to become like CEO of some really, really big company. People working on regular corporate jobs, especially in the creative industries, they don't really have to come from this business background. And so I thought France was a bit like those countries. I realized later on that no, we're going to come back to that later on. Yeah. But I thought, okay, that's good enough, because I mean, it's a master's, it's in history, it's in fashion. It shows that I know a lot about fashion when doing that, and I learn a lot about fashion. So it was a bit like that, my reasoning. Well, I'm going to go to university. So I went to university. I didn't go to business school. I went to the Versailles University. It wasn't in Paris, but I was picked in some unis in France, especially in Paris. I wanted to come to Paris. I didn't want to come to France. That's important as well. So I've applied to many universities in Paris. I was picked by quite a few. And my idea of picking my master's was always to say, okay, if it doesn't work out, what's the plan B? Which masters will open me the door for the plan B? Mm-hmm. So that's when I picked the cultural history one. And I also always had this bit of academic side. And I said, so plan C, if fashion doesn't work, if museum doesn't work, I can do a PhD and end up as a faculty staff, end up doing research, because it's something I really like. So it was a bit how I reasoned.
Okay. So really interesting, just to I mean, your dream was to work in fashion, but in a way, you didn't pursue a master in fashion or fashion business. Was fashion business part of your thought process at that moment, or not really? Like you really said, okay, let's go to for plan B, and I will figure out a way to go into fashion.
I didn't know that you could learn about fashion business. It was something
Okay.
that it was really being a foreigner. I think that it's a bit different because
Okay.
what I went to see. So despite being a foreigner, I've been learning French since I was 13 or 14. So I used to go to the Alliance Française, and I think those foreigners know what I'm talking about. And so there was a lot about French culture. So we had those student fairs and mostly schooling fairs, student fairs. And they talked a lot about French universities, but they didn't talk about business schools or even fashion business schools.
Yeah.
It was very specific. And when I was Googling, I didn't know. I learned about the IFM when I was in France. And
Okay. Yeah.
so I hadn't heard of it. And it's not something when you go to the Alliance Française and you've got Campus France who comes to you to say, especially not almost 10 years ago, I think it's changed a bit now.
Yeah.
They would say, okay, well, there's the IFM, which is the best fashion business school in the world. Like I didn't know when Googling, I couldn't really find it. So it was really university. And in Brazil, we're very university. So I only had universities in mind. And then here, in my first year, I realized that there was the IFM, the ESMOD, which are the oldest fashion schools. And I said, well, after I finish my master's, I'm going to apply for another master's so I can have the fashion school master's then. Okay. But it's something that only came when I was in France. I didn't know that.
And you discover it here.
How France works.
Okay.
Sure.
Now that's super interesting. And what would you say? What have you? Let's say, what are the insider learnings that you got from that master? Because it sounds really broad, working in museums. So I'm curious. What would you say are the main insights that you get from that master's?
So what was really really interesting is that it gave me this very broad understanding of society in general, which is very important. And I think we have to see fashion as something that's part of what we call our material culture. So fashion is something that we create based on some sort of, I would say, zeitgeist. I'm trying to use easy words. I'm going to leave the academic side and go to the practical side. So, I mean, we live in a society. And our society is shaped by how we feel about our fears, our aspirations, about what's going on in the world. So, and it's going to have an impact on what we create. We cannot just say, okay, fashion is a business and people are creating, designers are designing the ivory tower in the room and we are producing, following, I don't know, because we're part of a group and following what the stakeholders are saying and what and what I know the CEO says. No, fashion is part of broader society and it's part of a system. And I think that coming from the social sciences, coming from political science, I understand that in a very deep way. And it always allowed me to have this broader view of fashion and understanding and approaching. I think I approach collections, every time I see something related to fashion, I have this very sociological eye to it. And it's something that I find is very interesting because it helps me to connect close and connect to the whole business in a different way that I wouldn't have if I came from this strict business training, I think.
Okay. Now it's super interesting what you said, that fashion is part of a broader system, and sometimes we forgot because the image and the glamour of that industry. But I like the fact that you said that your perspective it's fashion inside the system, and then you have that sociology, anthropology, and other cultural point of view that allow you to think about fashion, and as you say, when you look at collections in another way, that it's less, let's say, just image or consumption per se, which is let's say, the first thing we discover when we are younger, and you put it in perspective. So it is really interesting. That's great. And so you were saying that you were between France and London. What does it mean? Where were you into between the two?
So I think that today, and this is my very personal opinion, that Paris is the capital of fashion, but London is a bit of its beating heart.
Okay.
English designers, I love seeing London Fashion Week because they have an approach to clothing, they have an approach to fashion, which is really interesting. I think it's a country that's been really marked by multiple waves of counterculture. And since the 60s with the Beatles and swinging in London and the punk movement and the post-punk movement. And I'm a big fan of music as well. And I love English music David Bowie is basically my hero. So and I can see his influence on fashion up to this day. So I really, really, really like English brands, and I really like what they do. Historically, my favorite designers, my big three, which were John Galliano, Alexander McQueen, and Vivienne Westwood, they're all English. So I wanted to be part of that universe, but there's a big problem when we don't come from a very rich family, which is London is ridiculously expensive to live in. Education in the UK in those past 10 years became prohibitively expensive as well. So for me, there was no way to do that financially. I could not study in the UK, live in London and try my luck there as I could here in Paris. Because despite Paris being a very expensive city, the cost of living has nothing to do with London. So it was a bit, I had to pick my second best. But it turned out great. I'm really happy nowadays. I'm really happy with my job. I'm really happy with my friends. I've become Parisian. So I'm really happy in France. But in the beginning, that was hard. And I think it's something that it's something we don't really realize. But when we move countries, especially when up to this day, my friends, sometimes they make jokes. I've got a lot of French friends. So they make some jokes about things from French pop culture. I have no idea what they're talking about because I didn't grow up with that. It wasn't exported. France exported the Nouvelle Vague. They exported philosophers. They exported a lot of very high things. They didn't export it, Jules or anything from Bande Organisée. So when my friends make jokes about that, I'm like, what are you talking about? So
it is hard.
It's hard to become French. It's easier to become English it's easier to become Londonian than it is to become Parisian if I have the money for it, which I don't have.
Okay. So you were basically traveling over there while you were in France, or it was just like you had a passion for London and then that's where your heart kind of was?
I had already been, so I had studied a bit in London before, but still doing political science. Spent a lot of time in the museum, spent a lot of time in the Victoria and Albert, but I was studying political science and democracy and all those boring things. And then ever since I moved to Paris, I think I've been to London at least once a year.
Okay.
But not for work, for leisure. But every time I go, and it's something that's also very important in my growing up and became really, really important today, is that I've always loved department stores. For me, who am really curious and want to know everything about everything, going to a store where you can see the best from what I imagine to be every single brand in the world, is incredible. So I remember the first time I went to London, I was 15, and I think it's a funny story. I need to tell the story. So as I said, I'm a big music fan, and when I was 13, I was a huge Guns N' Roses fan. I had this massive crush on 80s Axl Rose with his long ginger hair. And with some friends, I would spend the night during the summer holidays, like playing online and doing things online with friends from all around Brazil. And one of my friends, there was a thing in Brazil, there was a big in Brazil, and I think it was only in Brazil, which was called Photolog, which is Instagram's great grandfather.
Okay.
You could post one picture a day with a description, and you had like 10 friends who could comment on it.
Oh, yeah, exactly. Yeah, the grandfather, exactly the same.
It's Instagram for people who from the 90s. And one night I was like playing with friends. We used to play like online games and things like that. And we exchanged Instagrams back then. Oh, sorry, Photologs back then, not Instagrams. And I see that one of the girls I was playing with, I don't know what we were playing. It's Hangman. We were playing Hangman. So basically you have to guess the word at like 3 a.m. during the summer day. And I go to this girl's Photolog and I see she lives in London. And I was like, it's my dream to live in London. It's always been my dream. My mum says that it was always my dream. And I was like, oh, you live in London and you're Brazilian. How come? And she's like, oh, my mum works for the Navy here, for the Brazilian Navy here. I was like, it's so funny because my dad works for the Brazilian Navy and they knew each other.
No.
I made a really good friend for Guns N' Roses, and it allowed me to make my dream of going to London true. So for my 15th birthday, and it's another big thing in Brazil, it's like in Mexico, they have the quinceañera.
Yeah.
And the US, they have the Super Sweet 16.
Yeah.
We have our version of the Super Sweet 16 when we're 15.
Okay.
But wearing a princess ball gown and dancing the waltz wasn't really my thing. So I told my mom, look, I don't want to do that, but if you want to send me to London to my friend's house, I'm in.
Give me the budget for the party to go to.
Exactly. Exactly. Like my mom, I think she was a bit gutted. She wanted me wearing like a princess ball gown like I did when I was a child and dressed up in Disney princesses gowns. But she was like, yeah, of course. So she sent me to my friend's place when I was 15. I did everything I loved back then, which I still love nowadays, which is going to museums. So I went to the National Gallery, I went to the Victoria and Albert Museum, which was amazing. I went to the Tate Modern, I went to all these museums, and of course I went to Harrods 3 times in 2 weeks.
The time to visit each floor in detail.
Very detailed, throw a coin at the Diana, like fountain, everything. And it's a ritual. It's been a ritual for the past 15 years of my life. Every time I go to London, I go to at least one department store, and I do it from basement to top floor. I see the brands. I see how they're presented. I see if they have something else, if they got pop-ups, exhibitions, how things are, how the windows are, and it's very inspiring. And as I've been working in department stores for the past 4 years, so for the past 4 years, I also have this very how can I say, it's very critical eye to see, okay, which brands they have that I don't have, how do they present the brands that I have, what's the difference? So I don't know, in a brand that's very widely distributed, what we have in my selection, what they have in their selection, what are the colors, what's the difference, what's similar. So I think it's interesting because I go for the experience, but I also go with my kind of trend hunting eye to see if there's the new hot brand that I need to know about. And then also the benchmarking eye to see what they are doing, what am I doing, and what's the difference and what the similarities between the both of us.
Okay, super interesting what you're saying, that you learn about like department store, not learn but enjoy department store at 15, and now almost 15 years later, now you work as a buyer. So it's really like a journey. What would you say, like, for somebody like it's 15, 18 years old that say, okay, my dream is to work in fashion, maybe in a department store. What would you say, like the few advice to start having like that critical eye that you talk about? What would be the type of advice you give them?
I think, and what's really interesting about fashion buying is that both business and creativity. So when you're a fashion buyer, you have to be both. So I think one interesting thing is that if you're thinking of becoming a buyer and you don't know where to start about, you should start learning about the fashion market, so the positioning. I think it's very important to understand how the fashion market is organized in terms of price points, because then you'll be able to develop your creative eye from that, because you're going to learn how the brands, they're going to talk to each other, and you're going to see, I think you're going to see brands in a different way, because so the fashion market we usually have, so if you ignore all the fast fashion, because it's a different system, you've got the entry-level brands, which are going to be in a department store. They're going to be the entry price points of the cheapest brands. And usually department stores, brands are clustered by type of market. So when you know that you've got the entry price, then you've got a more of a contemporary brands, then you've got the premium brands, then you've got the designer brands, and then you've got the luxury brands. Once you understand that department stores, they organize like that, you go see the brands by clusters. If you're a Parisian or you live near Paris, we have 4 department stores in Paris. Come with this in mind and see from each cluster which brands they have. And then today internet is your best friend. Go online, go not only to Vogue, because Vogue, I mean, is an institution, and Vogue Runway is an institution, it's very important. But try also following some Instagram brands, some fashion critics who are mostly on Instagram or have blogs. Because if you want to see the big luxury brands, go to Vogue because they invited the first row. If you want to know what emerging brands from all the price points that come, especially new designers, new contemporary designers, go see some upcoming fashion critics, because then you're going to see brands that are not making a buzz yet, but they might make a buzz tomorrow. And then you're going to see the creative side of the brand, because it's always very cool to see a show, because you see the new things, how people are walking. But once you understand that they're part of this bigger system, and when you know with which brands they are competing, and where they want to be, either in the department store or in a concept store, you're going to understand the business behind it. And then you're going to start thinking critically, saying, if I were a buyer, would I buy this brand? Where would I put it? With which brands? And as I said, that when I like to see different department stores to see how we compete, you'd always say, okay, if they were competing, how would I buy the collection? If I only have a rack with 12 clothes, and they're side to side, they have kind of the same price point, and they are directed to kind of the same clientele. What I'm going to pick from brand A, what I'm going to pick from brand B, so my client buy from both. So I think it's a very interesting exercise, and it's something that I try to do when I'm benchmarking during my holidays.
Oh, great advice. I love the way you think about it. It's all about like think first about the system and the framework, and where every brand and like they are located in that different system, and what I love the clusters that you talk about. I think it's a great advice. I think what is really interesting about what you just said, it's also about the customer, about how different department store talk maybe to different customer, or how each cluster talk to different customer, and how you try to create like the best assortment for your customer with the brand in the different type of cluster, and knowing that you may be in competition with the other department store, or even the retail, because brands have the retail. So it is really interesting. So that's great. I like the advice, and I think they're really useful. Something before we go to the let's say the buying part of it. It's something that always strike me. It's also how many languages that you speak. And is that something that you say you started French early on? Is that something that you decided to do, or is that something your family or like kind of push you to learn?
It's something that really came from me. It's I had this, as I was saying earlier on, my mom said I've always wanted to live in London. Probably because of the Spice Girls, and then from Harry Potter.
Yeah.
But in Brazil, we are very Americanized. So from a very early age, we hear a lot of English. Music is mostly, it used to be, now it's changed a bit, but when I was a child, it was mostly in English, especially with pop singers. So the Spice Girls, and then Britney Spears, and then like Backstreet Boys and everything that was huge in Brazil. And it really bothered me not to understand what they were singing. So I think I've always had this thing that I want to understand things. So I started English from a very young age. But first at school, then at an English speaking school, an English language school, and then I don't know why, but I was wanted to learn French, and it was very funny because I was the only person learning French in my school, like in my class, and I remember telling my mom my parents they did learn, so both my parents they speak French as well. They learned French, but it wasn't something that... It was something that people just did back then. You had to learn English and French. You did because you did. And I remember really wanting to learn French. And so I didn't really have plans to move to France, as I said. Many times I wanted to move to London from a very early age. So it wasn't something that I approached as, okay, it's something that I'm going to use later on in my life. It was just because I wanted to learn the language. And I think there was also, it's very funny because I speak really bad Spanish despite being Brazilian. Instead of learning Spanish, I decided to learn French. And I think there's also this image that France is a very sophisticated country and French is a very sophisticated language. And I think we still had that in Brazil back then. So my parents were really excited with the fact that I wanted to learn this very sophisticated language. And it came in handy because when I was a teenager, I really liked the Nouvelle Vague and like French cinema. So it was really interesting to not really understand what they were saying, but kind of understand what they were saying. And I really liked literature, so reading that later on. Then despite being from an Italian family, my dad doesn't speak Italian. And for me, it was a shame because it is like not our ancestral language, but for me, it was important to learn that. So I started learning Italian, and at the same time, I'm a big fan of Italian cinema, so I was really happy to understand what they were saying. And it's easier when you are learning Italian to understand what people say in Italian films than in French. It was very funny because I was really always very frustrated with the fact that despite years of French, I still struggled before moving to France, to understand what people were saying. And then I had this crazy thing where I really wanted to learn German. I think because it was hard, it was perceived as a hard language. And also, I think people are not going to remember that, but some 10, 12 years ago, Germany was really, really big. And they were really, I think they also had a bit of this soft power cultural influence. Germany was becoming quite pop. So I did many years of German and I forgot most of it instead of moving to France because it's a hard language. But it allowed me to live a bit in Berlin as well. After living in Italy, I spent, not very long, but 2 months in Berlin to improve my German. And I just fell in love with the city. And actually, I considered moving to Berlin before moving to France.
Yeah.
But I wanted, as I said, I want to work with fashion, and fashion in Germany is a bit complicated. Let's just say that. Historically, there have been really good designers. There's also Jill Sander, who was German. There is a bit of fashion, but there's Hugo Boss. I think besides Hugo Boss, there's not much of a fashion, and my Theresa nowadays, you don't really have much of a fashion business over there. Yeah. So practically a bit complicated. Then what else do I speak? And also a bit of Spanish because I had Spanish at school. It's similar to Portuguese. So I also speak a language that exists in Latin America and nowhere else, which is the Portuñol, which is the mix of Portuguese and Spanish. Well. And during the lockdown, I learned ancient Greek.
Because it's really useful for the fashion industry.
It is. I mean,
It is.
it's a very, I mean, it's the most useful language I know.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
just like, I don't know, I had this crazy thing as a child as well, that I think I read the Odyssey for Kids or something like that when I was 10, and I was obsessed about Greece as a child. And I went to Athens 2 years ago, and basically a friend of mine, he had to stop me from collapsing in the Acropolis. I'm a big fan of history, so I was a big fan of Athens. I needed to learn that language. And I'm someone who, I think that either I do something wholeheartedly, or don't do it at all. I think I have some obsessions.
Yeah,
So
it is a good way to put it. What always listening to you, what really struck me is the passion and the curiosity you have for what you love. So when you see you want to understand a country and a culture, and the first thing you do is learn the language. From there, like you're able to understand the nuances. And you see, you wanted to be in fashion, you understand the system of fashion, which is kind of the underlying language that, the grammar of the fashion industry. So it's like you always have to kind of, you said, academic point of view about understanding something, and you just go deep in it. And what is really unique is you have that curiosity, you just go for it, and then you find ways to mix and wave all those knowledge into your one big passion, which is fashion. And as you said, because fashion is part of a broader society, everything connects and makes sense. So it is quite unique way of doing things, and it's I love it. It's great.
thank you.
Um, Now let's tell me a little bit about how you end up working in the department store, because that was your passion. So you study, you learn the languages, you did your master. So how did you finally end up in the fashion industry, and especially in department store?
So during my masters, I was doing a few internships, and I I did some research internships in the beginning. One with a fashion history seminar, which still exists, from the IHTP, which is I haven't followed the courses in a while, but it's also how I got to know the IFM, because they had a conference about fashion during the First World War at the IFM. And I had just arrived in France. I had been in France for 2 months, and the conference was at the IFM, and it was co-organized by the IFM. That's how I got to know them. And so my first internship was, and then with Sophie from this, who today is a professor of fashion at the American University of Paris. And so I was doing a bit of fashion research, more like fashion history. I said, well, this is cool, but I need to get some industry. I need to get industry practice experience. So a friend, and I was looking, I remember being at fashion jobs looking for internships. I was like, well, there's no internship for fashion buyers, so how do I get to become one? And I was a bit lost, having a look at it. And then a friend of mine, she told me, well, I have a friend who's interning at this fashion brand, and they're looking for someone at the sales department to do B2B sales. Would you be interested? I was like, yeah, of course. So I sent him my CV, and I had a 5-minute interview. And when the guy saw how many languages I spoke, he hired me on the spot.
Okay.
Which is crazy. So basically something that I had been learning just because I liked learning came in really, really handy years later. Because it was this budding, very young fashion brand. I think it was his second selling season or third selling season. And it was the sales department, and I was assisting him with European accounts, but all across Europe. So there was a lot of prospection. So picking up the phone, calling potential customers, sending brand books, trying to get buyers interested in the fashion, in the brand.
Okay.
So, which is not an easy job, and today as a buyer, I try to be nice to everyone who approaches me, because it's basically you spend your day calling people, getting no's, getting ignored. You send them invitations to come to your showroom, they don't come. You're trying to make your brand known by people who have the power of getting your brand inside somewhere. That's huge. And buyers actually have a lot of power, which it's interesting, because before I became a buyer, I was like, well, it's a very powerful job. And nowadays, I don't really approach it like that, because I'm really busy with the daily tasks and the daily things and trying to get like a brand to send me assets on time, the less glamorous part of the job. But actually, buyers are really, really powerful for especially emerging brands. Because if you get a buyer from a big website, from a big department store, or from a concept store that in terms of turnover is not that big, but can set the conversation, like the Dover Street Market or the Wool store in Berlin, you can make it or break your brand. So, and then there was a small brand and they needed someone to approach buyers by calling. So I think you have to be really resilient as well when you're in sales. And it was really, and for them it was incredible that they could hire someone who spoke pretty much most languages that are spoken in Europe. So I was doing that for 6 months, and it was really cool because it was very international. You've got buyers from all around the globe, or you try to reach them. And I did that for 6 months. Then I was approached for another brand to do the same thing, a small brand as well. So I did the same thing for a different brand. For this first brand, I was working in menswear, more of a contemporary positioning brand. Then I went to this women's wear, a bit lifestyle, a bit of an entry price point brand, but I did accessories, which was really fun. And it was really cool because, so another thing is that depending on the kind of product category you're working, you've got different fairs, you've got different ways of making your brand known. So this brand, as she was working with accessories, it also allowed me to go to the Première Classe, which is one of the biggest fairs in the world in terms for accessories brands. So it was really cool because I was there on the stand trying to approach buyers from big department stores, big websites, but even buyers who have a small store in a French Riviera city. They have like 10 brands, they buy, I don't know, 10K a season. But it's important to be everywhere when you're a brand. So it was really interesting also for me to understand even better the market. So which brands were competing with the brands that I was working with. Especially in France, because France is also I think I learned when I was in the sales department is that different countries, they have different ways of selling things. So when you're working with Italy, it's not a department store country. You've got one department store, which is La Rinascente. They're like in maybe 5 or 10 big cities in Italy. So if you go to a big city, you're going to have a Rinascente. But people in Italy, they live a lot in small towns that orbitate around big cities. So you've got a lot of multi-brand stores that are in cities never heard of. And it's very important. And they are, so when you're working with Italy, when you're a brand, you've got many small accounts that are going to do very, very high-end brands. And it's true, sometimes in a small town in Italy, you've got a church, a very old church, the train station, and a luxury store. So it's crazy. So it's how distribution is in Italy. Then you go to London, like to the UK, where it's a very department store and e-commerce country. People buy a lot online. So you're going to have a few UK accounts, but they're really big accounts. And then you've got France, which is a hybrid. So in France, we've got 4 big department stores, and 2 of them are in chain, which are the Printemps and the Galeries Lafayette, Galeries Lafayette being the biggest one. And then you've got, especially outside Paris, in the south, in the southwest, we've got different regions. You've got some sort of concept stores, and you've got many accounts from concept stores. So basically, usually when you're working in sales in France, you have to reach at least one of the big 4. And then you have also to reach those stores, which are very important parts of those mid to small sized cities. And so it's really interesting because I learned a lot about the business as well. So about distribution, about the kind of brands, and they're not buying the same brands. They're not buying, and even the same brand, they're not buying the same way. Mm-hmm. So it was really interesting, and I was on sales. And then I was looking for my first job. And I remember my last internship was at a very big, especially women's wear brand, a French institutional brand. And I remember my last day, I was seeing my director, and he was like, so tell me about your 6 months and how was the internship? And I started crying, saying, I'm going to get into the job market and I don't know if I'm going to get a job.
Yeah.
And he was like, I don't worry about you. And I'm going to be fine. And a month later, I landed my first job.
Okay.
So, and I was working with e-commerce. It was a 6 month assistant buying job. But it was different because it was basically an online outlet that did flash sales. And it's a very different, so it's yet another business model, because basically what we did, we bought overstock from brands, and then we put that online at high discounts so it could be sold. And it was really interesting because I hadn't worked with this kind of model before. I only worked with full price, wholesale, classic distribution. So I could see how an online flash sales outlet works. I learned a lot about business as well, because they were very, okay, what's the turnover I can make with this brand? What's the margin I'm making with this brand? What kind of price can I negotiate with the brands to have this margin? Okay, we need to set a price because they're flexible to set their own buying and selling prices. So, okay, we have competition because we're not the only online sales outlet in the world. So what competition is doing, what kind of prices we're going to put. So it was really interesting. I learned a lot about Excel as well. So, it's very important when you're buying, you have to be familiar with Excel. And it was the best training I could ever had. And I did that for 6 months. But I realized that it was really interesting, but what I loved wasn't there, which was the product. What I really liked about fashion were the shows, the novelty, the products, and I didn't really have that. Because we were buying stocks. Even if I were working for an e-com platform, I would be close to the product because I'll be going to showrooms and buying the collections. With this job, I was completely disconnected from that. So I saw an opportunity of joining a department store where we met, at the Bon Marché, almost 4 years ago. I'd applied and I was picked. And I was really, really, really happy because for me, that was the moment I said, okay, I made it. You know, I got my foot in the door of a massive institution it wasn't a dream job yet, but I'm really close to the dream job. That's it.
Yeah.
And that's the moment I said, okay, that's it.
That's it. I mean,
yeah.
You tell us a little bit about the Bon Marché. You talked about Excel and learning about the business, the wholesale, and you went into detail on that. And those are great, advice, and give an awesome overview about the distribution. Again, for somebody who's starting, what would you say are kind of the skills they need to kind of go into those fashion, more business areas? So you talk about Excel. What else have you learned and think that could be useful to have in mind when you go into those jobs?
So I think it's important that we have both hard and soft skills. Mm-hmm. So in terms of hard skills, you have to know it's very, I would say it's very basic. You're not going to know the amount of Excel or understand margins and rentability as someone who's in finance, for instance. Mm-hmm. But you have to understand that mostly when you're buying, you're there to make money. You have to understand that. So we love the fashion. We love the product, but we're there to make money and to turn on a profit. I think it's very important to have that in mind. So you have to learn how to read your brand. what's the turnover I'm going to make with my brand at a shop? How much, because that's going to determine how much I'm going to buy, right? My OTB. So how much do I have to buy? And then you have to learn, it's quite basic, but okay, from that, I'm buying at this price, I'm selling at this price. It means that technically, what's the margin? So what's the profit it's going to make me? Then you have to understand a bit of statistics, but very basic. So to make my turnover, what's the product that's making most of it? Because that's a good product. What's the product that's not living up to its potential? Then you're going to see your brand. So I was supposed to have, I don't know, a 55% margin, and I have a brand that's only giving me 20%. Why? Is it because there's a pricing problem? Is it because I'm only selling at discount? So when you understand the maths of the business, which once again, very basic, it's not rocket science, you understand how your brand is living, and it's very important for you to make decisions, because it's sad, but sometimes we love brands because we love the style, but when you see the figures, they're just not there. And unfortunately, it's the hard part of the business. You're saying, okay, well, this brand is supposed to make me money, it's not making me money. So unfortunately, it's not here. Maybe it's for a different store, but not for my store. So I think this is the hard skills part. So understanding the maths, because you understand how your brand is performing, and when you understand how your brand is performing, you understand how to make it perform even better. And then the soft skills. When you're in buying, you're in touch with so many people, from the salespeople to the back office, from people internally. I mean, I've been to galleries for almost 2 months now. I still don't know half of the people who I'm talking to, because it's so big. So you have to like to be in touch with people. If you're someone who's an introvert, if you're someone who would rather be like in your room behind the computer, not talking to people, this is not a job for you. Because there's a lot, I mean, I'm a very people person, so it's really cool. But there's a lot of small talk. There's a lot also, even sometimes when you have a bad message, a tough message to go, like, to pass, if you've got a bit of people skills, it's easier, and it's easier to collaborate. So you have to have like people skills. I think the soft part of the job, soft skills, is having people skills, being passionate about the product as well. So really being interested in new trends and being interested in that. And so, and serious, because it can become tiring. When you've got a portfolio of 40 brands, it means that you're going to see at least every 6 months, at least 40 showrooms. So if you don't like seeing the product, if you don't like seeing your stats, and if you don't like dealing with people when it's good, and especially when it's bad, this is not the job for you. I think it's important to know that the people part is very important. When things run smoothly, it's great. When things don't run smoothly, and I have a few brands in my portfolio that are not going smoothly, it's tough. It's tough. And you have to have the flexibility. You have to know how to talk to people, because it's important to, it's complicated, and well, we're humans after all, and sometimes if you don't know how to address the things, there's a person behind it, and it might get complicated.
Yeah. It is interesting. I like that you focus a lot on the soft skills, because you have the hard skills, but the soft skills at the end. We work in a passionate passion industry, let's say, and people are passionate with emotions, and we like to talk and exchange. And it's always like, what's beautiful in this industry is that it's the people that make the industry as well, even though the rhythm is super fast, sometimes it's tiring, and we are impatient because there are so many things at the same time. But at the end of the day, what makes it really beautiful is the people. That's why during COVID it was so hard not seeing people anymore, not seeing the product. And after, it was like one of the main things was to let's see again the buyers, let's see again the brands and the designers. So I totally understand that, and I think it's a really good point. And can you explain a little bit what is the role of a buyer, and how you in the position you are now today? How does it work in the day-to-day?
So buying it's interesting because like we do so much things. So okay, back to the basics. We are responsible for what you see in a store, and we're responsible for the rentability of what you see in store. So we have to be trend aware. We need to know what's going on. Of course, it's not me who's going to do the trend hunting. We've got people whose job is to do that, and they're going to brief that. But we have to be a bit sensitive to that and see what's happening, see what brands are doing. Then we're always in touch with salespeople. That's Fashion Week. During Fashion Week, we're not going to go to the shows. Unfortunately, the system's changed, so we're not going to go to the shows unless it's a small brand, or usually it's my boss that goes to the shows, not me, unfortunately. But we're going to go to the showrooms and we're going to see the collections. So when we go, before each appointment, I have a look of how my brand's performing for the current season and for the past season, because we always buy a year before. So now I'm buying winter 23. I'm seeing how my brand performed in winter 22. So I need to know how many products I buy, what products I'm buying, what products from a brand are performing well, which products are not performing well. So it will help me to make a selection. And sometimes it's really hard. Yesterday I was with the brand and I was like, okay, well, we bought way too much in terms of products last year. Let's rationalize it. And then I see some things which are amazing and that I love. And I was like, yeah, but my client doesn't love this, so I cannot buy this. So it's hard. It's hard because we have to remember we're not buying for ourselves. When I was in menswear, it was easier because I'm not a man. Now I'm working in women's wear, and I'm working with a price point that I could buy. I'm not working with luxury brands. So it's very hard, and you have to refrain yourself from not buying for yourself. You have to say, I saw this thing which was amazing. It's like, well, but the store, especially now I work with the department store that's present everywhere in France, and I buy for everywhere. So when I see my brand, I'm like, well, I love this in Paris, but will my client who lives in the southwest of France wear this? No, she won't, so I cannot buy this. So it's in the showroom, there's a bit of, you're always like dealing with yourself saying, okay, this is what performs well, so I need to buy this. This could be fun to add because we need some fun pieces to have the client come to the brand. But mostly, as I said, we're there to make money, so I need to see what performs well. And then once I bought everything, I follow my brand throughout the season. So marketing has become really important. So we have many marketing activations. I'm always in touch trying to have brands to join us at something, either a pop-up, or we've got something, I don't know, Valentine's Day, Mother's Day, Father's Day. So we've got these moments in store that we're going to do something special. I want to bring a brand there because it's cool for the brand, it's cool for us, it's beneficial for both of us to have the brand there. Then you've got like some daily business, once again, Excel and stats to see how the brand's performing, what we can adjust. Because in the end, we're all there to make money. And I think it's important to say that because, as we're saying, because it's a passion industry, we do that for passion, but we have the power, the sword of Damocles that's behind the back, especially when you're buying it's money. We need to make money. And I think we have to have, I'm sorry, it's horrible, it's very capitalistic to say, but that's, once again, that's society. And as Adam Smith would say, it's not out of the, how would say, that basically when we have bread, it's not because the baker, he's making bread because he loves us. No, he's making bread because he needs to sell his bread. Yeah. So in the end, it's that, but it's a fun way to do that, and it's better than being in the stock market or being just behind the figures. I don't know, when you're saying, I don't know, in finance and you only see the figures, I couldn't do that. But knowing that to get to the figures, I'm going through really cool clothes and getting in touch with cool people and doing really fun things such as pop-ups or marketing pushes. It's part of my job, and it's really interesting, and it's my day-to-day life.
That's why my question is like, how do you balance, that drive you have, that curiosity, passion for history, and you say the system, and now you have the job that it's more like business, capitalistic, and turnover and margins. How are you able to balance all of that?
What was really interesting and about how fashion has evolved lately is that storytelling has become really important. So every time I approach a brand, I approach something, I always ask myself, what's the story we're telling here? And also buying, especially when it's for a physical medium, when it's like a department store, we are in touch with a lot of people from the floor, salespeople. So it's interesting as well because I am a people person. So I'm always in touch with someone. There's always something physical I can touch. So I think it also fits my creative part. Even if my history part, my sociology part is not very fed by my day-to-day job, my people part it is. And also brands nowadays, climate change is an urgency. It's something that is behind our backs, and brands are more and more aware of that. So we actually have really interesting conversations about society with brands, because the way we consume is changing, the things we worry about is changing, and this conversation is part also of my daily business, of my daily work, because especially for the departments I'm working right now, they're really, 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 how can I say, for them it's very important. Inclusivity, size inclusivity, the fashion system, changing the fashion system, making it greener, it's very important. So in the end, those are society matters, society questions, and I'm not approaching that with this very academic side saying, oh, we're discussing that because this philosopher said this, this and that, but it's a practical part of a lot of what we learn theoretically. So in the end, it's really interesting because, well, behind us we're making money, but we're trying to change things as well. And it's that's very inspiring that it's part, and it's also part of a bit of our corporate brand, that we're trying to change things, and we're a big actor and trying to do that. So in the end, it's really interesting because even if it's not feeding my pure historically part, in the end, yes, because I work for a very historic department store that's been around for 150 years. So I'm part of history now.
It's true. I love that. That's exactly what you said about you study it, and now you are living it. You are part of it. You are making history yourself, and you are part of that dialogue in society. So it's like now you are in action in it. So it makes sense. And I know we're gonna arrive more or less at the end of our time. Last question would be like, how that the PhD encompass in all of that?
So yeah, I've been doing a PhD at the same time.
I know.
And so, as I had said, I always thought of academic would be like the plan C. Now I know that I can actually work my plan A and plan C at the same time once I'm done with that. So it's really interesting because I study storytelling from an academic point of view. My thesis is about a very specific storytelling part, which is about the heritage of brands. Mm-hmm. So it feeds my history part, my history blog part. And how brands, they developed a storytelling for customers based on the history, on the heritage. And it's really interesting because even if most of the brands I work with, they're not really heritage brands because they're quite new, mm-hmm. They always have some sort of storytelling. And that's what makes the brand interesting in the end. Because I don't know, if you want to buy jeans, how many denim brands do you have? But brands with a message, brands with a history, like with a story, and with a history as well. If you go with brands like Levi's or Lee, we don't really have that many in the market. And usually those that are telling a story, they're more interesting, even for me as a buyer, because I believe a bit more in them. And for customers, because in the end, consumption, when we're buying something, we also want to, it's not only, how can I say, so when we're buying clothes, it's not like buying eggs or buying water or buying things that we need to leave. We go beyond that. We go beyond the materialistic part of the pure survival, but we get into the realm of self-expression as well. And I think it's very important for the customers to, and people, even unconsciously, we do that. When buying clothes, we're expressing a bit of ourselves, either because this brand, it has the same values as I do, or this brand corresponds to my aspirations, or this brand makes me belong to a certain group. So when we buy into that very unconsciously, and brands, something I studied in my PhD as well, and brands with a story, they're going to feed that. Like, for instance, I'm someone who's had a growing interest in climate change and things like that. And it's become very important when I'm buying a product. It's to see, what is this brand doing to either change the system or do something better, and how is it being told? So this part of my PhD is really interesting because I do have this critical approach about the stories, but at the same time I'm very sensitive to the stories of brands, and I think I'm a bit more sensitive than someone who wouldn't have been studying this kind of subject.
Yeah, makes sense. So I love that you wrapped up that everything come back to the story, how a brand it's linked to the society, and how now one of the stories is about climate change and sustainability, and how does the story also make the customer maybe consume in a different way, because there is a status, there is a meaning, there is a story behind it. So how you as a buyer need to filter and curate that for the customer. So again, everything makes sense. Your passion is linked, and then you weigh that into it. Isabella, thank you a lot for your time. I know you have a day ahead of you. Thank you a lot for your time. If you have what would be last recommendation for the people listening to us, anything that you would add, what would it be to conclude?
Stay curious. I think it's the most important thing. Stay passionate. Because, well, we talked about everything that was really successful in my career, but I've had some downturns. And Lucas, you were there, some of them. And if you don't stay passionate, you might give up. And I think always look into the bigger picture. It's something that, as an advice I give to everyone, either in fashion or outside it, look into the bigger picture. So sometimes, and fashion is an industry where you have to deal a lot with frustration. Either because you're an emerging designer and you have no buyers coming to see your brand, either because you're looking for an internship and you've been through a lot of interviews and you didn't get a job, or you get into the job market and it's taking a bit longer than you expected. There's a lot of frustration. And so stay curious, stay passionate, because it will help you, and look into the bigger picture because it's going to help you navigate through the tough times.
It's an excellent one. Frustration, but stay curious and passionate, and keep moving.
Exactly. Keep swimming.
I love it. Thank you again for your time, Isabella. I hope to see your career evolve, and maybe have a session two together later on.
Great pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Is she not incredible? I don't know about you, but I love how Isabella's drive to learn and live her fashion dream, it's so palpable. So what can we keep from this deep dive in Isabella's journey? 1, in order to think like a buyer, make sure to do your homework early on in your career. Go visit stores, analyze the offer, the brand mix, and the story they are trying to tell you. Get acquainted with the system. 2, fashion is an industry of passionate professionals, but it's first and foremost a business. So always remember to balance what you personally love with the financial objective or your job. 3, your professional trajectory might not be a straight line. Doesn't mean that you are not going in the right direction. Remember, there is not one perfect way to get to your dream job. If you are still hearing this, thank you so much for tuning in. I know how much your time is valuable. If you enjoyed this episode and want to support the podcast, please subscribe and leave a review. This is the most efficient way to help us grow and entice people to listen to the show. If you have any question or want to know more about the podcast, please feel free to reach out on LinkedIn at Lucas Silva Edwards. In the next episode, I will receive Chiara Theophile. We will talk about her beginning of her journey so far and how focusing on gender studies can help you land a position in one of the top 5 French luxury brands in the planet and add a job I never heard before. Last but not least, please feel free to drop in the comment section any advice, improvement points, or even topics you wish to see covered in this podcast. Until next time, I wish you a wonderful day.